The Cinders of Dezu, written and read by Oliver Tonic. A tyrant king, a missing girl, and a journey through a perilous world. Join me for this completed sci-fi fantasy novel read as an audio series. Enjoy the story from here on, or binge from the beginning with the first episode. Like and subscribe if you enjoy. My audiobooks are totally free. If you'd like to donate to support my writing, though, check out my Patreon in the description. And now, back to the tale. Chapter 8, Manifestation. Cairo's palms felt very sweaty. He rubbed them on his new pants over and over again as his legs dangled from the back of the wagon. Julian thought he was nervous. "It's all right, man. We got this," he said, giving his shoulder a gentle, reassuring shake. His legs dangled off the wagon next to him. He spoke low enough that the driver couldn't hear. Cairo readjusted his open vest. It didn't fit too bad, all things considered. When they had changed earlier that morning, he had wondered if Harper had measured them while they slept. Julian had flipped through the Dezuian survival guide until he found the section about Talia again. Wherever they were, the book said they would be near a town. If they wanted to meet Talia after sending the signal, they had to find their way into the town the following morning. This led to a reference for another section of the book that discussed travel and city dwelling. The book said if you could make it to a main road, you could hitchhike into the nearest town on someone's wagon or selling cart. In exchange, though, it was customary to assist a seller going to market with unloading their goods. You could also work for them for a small wage as a wandering hand, a kind of freelance volunteer to the local market sellers. So the two addressed themselves in the local fashion as provided by Harper and collected their things in the burlap bags he had given them. They didn't know or much think about when they would be back, but as Cairo locked the doors with the key they had been given, he noticed for the first time that the doors of the house had holsters meant for barricades. It explained the wooden slats he had found stacked near the couch. He thought last night would have been a very good time to have known about them. He decided it didn't matter whether or not he had gotten to know all the ins and outs of the house. As he left that morning, he told himself he would never be back here again. If he could help it, once he'd retrieved Reyna, he'd make sure not to spend another night in this place called Dezu. The man who had stopped for them on the road was a light-skinned man with sandy brown hair and hazel eyes. He must have been somewhere in his late 30s with a friendly smile as he sat atop his wagon. Next to him sat what the boys had decided must have been his son. Not much more was expressed other than a gesture for the two of them to get in the back, indicating to them how common a wandering hand must have been. Cairo leaned his back up against the wooden crates and sacks bundled up behind them, still rubbing his hands on his clothes. This whole thing had been strange, and it was true that he was feeling nervous about going into the city. But the way his hands were sweating, he wasn't that nervous. He couldn't keep his palms dry for the life of him. "You should make a list. You always feel better when you make lists, right?" Julian said with a reassuring smile. Then he added, you should do it in your head because we don't have paper." They had been paying attention to the direction they were going, but the book assured them that whoever was traveling with goods on the road would be heading into the nearest town. So when the wagon stopped, it took them a moment to realize why. They turned around to see a stone wall, perhaps about 10 to 12 feet high. They were positioned in front of its entrance, a large set of open steel doors. They clearly needed two people to drag them open, as they were tall and wide enough to let caravans of various sizes through. There, two men stood at the ready with short swords holstered at their sides. A third man in the center walked up to address their wagon. He looked friendly and casually spoke to the driver about his goods with a smile. After a short discussion, he was given the go-ahead and they continued forward. As the boys passed the guards, they tried not to look out of place. They gave them a wave. The two men on either side of the doors gave them a friendly nod. Julian cocked his head as he noticed the guard on his side of the wagon had something going on with his nose. It was pointed in a way that felt very alien. He couldn't put his finger on why. Within a few minutes, they started putting things together. Both of them sat on the back of the wagon, dumbfounded as they entered the crowd within the town walls. It appeared this was a trading town because they saw little of actual homes. Instead, the streets were filled with small businesses and stands. People were calling out goods and services and forming lines. Dude? Cairo nodded. Yeah, man. I'm seeing it too. The streets were filled with various types of people they hadn't seen before. Some had blue skin of different shades, others were green. Some children nearby were chasing one another and had bright neon orange and yellow skin. A girl around their age was carrying a woven basket with bright white hair that stood up like a mohawk. Her hair contrasted with her skin, which was ink black. She watched their wagon pass with crystal blue eyes. Neither of them could stop staring at her. There were plenty of skin types that they had seen before, too, but some of them had pointed ears and strange eyebrows. Julian thought they looked like a hodgepodge of things he'd seen in sci-fi movies. A large man with a booming voice was calling out some foreign word they had never heard. His nose was ribbed all the way down, and his bald head had the same markings all the way to the back. They were so distracted by him that they were startled when the wagon came to a stop at an empty lot. Their driver got out and smiled at them as he nodded towards the goods they were leaning on. Cairo cleared his throat as they got off and began unloading. The two were silent as they tried to follow his instructions as to where he wanted each box and sack to be placed. It didn't take long to unload. Cairo leaned over to the side of the wagon to grab another sack filled with a type of potato he'd never seen. At the same time, Julian reached over to grab a small barrel of something. Well, at least our guy has normal skin, Julian whispered. Cairo smacked him on the shoulder. What? Is that racist? Dude, yes. Julian looked around until he spotted a fountain not terribly far into the crowd. It seemed to match the guidebook's description, even from where he stood. There it is, he said. Cairo looked over in the same direction and nodded. Go ahead and head over. There isn't much left to unload. Cool. Julian let go of the barrel he was starting to lift. He brushed his hands off and headed in the direction of the fountain. Cairo lifted his potato sack. The book stated it was customary to help someone unload in exchange for a ride, but payment was only given if you stayed for a half a day or a full day of selling goods and services. As long as one of them stayed to finish unloading, they would have paid their due to their driver. Cairo placed the potatoes near where the man and his son were setting up in their cart. He felt the sweatiness of his hands increase as he headed back to the wagon for another load. He looked to see Julian standing next to the fountain in the distance. Julian was leaned over the rim of the fountain looking in. It was round and made of an off-white stone. Underwater at the bottom, the stone had the same flame emblazoned in it that they had seen before in the crossover sanctuary. Julian put his hand in the pool and swished some water around. It was cool, but not too cool. Perfect for swimming, he thought. He sat on the edge of the fountain and looked around at the people doing business around him. He didn't seem to be the particular interest of anyone in the tumult of the city. He looked just like them. The clothes they wore felt like he was wearing a costume, but they were comfortable. He looked in the direction of Cairo, who looked like he was struggling with the last sack or two that he had left. He was leaned down, picking up potatoes from a sack he had dropped. He seemed to be having a hard time getting a good grip on each individual potato. Julian's eyebrows creased. His friend was starting to look rather awkward. Cairo lifted the sack and it slipped. He lifted again. It slipped once more. Julian found himself whispering to him under his breath. Dude, just pick it up. It seemed Cairo was incapable. He was now gathering the potatoes in a pile, sweeping them together awkwardly with his outstretched fingers. Julian could tell even from a distance that they were collecting street grime. The embarrassment was palpable as the stand owner and his son watched him. They looked rather irritated. This went on for a painfully extended period of time. Julian was so caught up in his friend's plight that he hadn't noticed the hooded figure that had now circled him and the fountain nearly 3 times. Cairo's leg seemed to stiffen before he fell over into the pile of potatoes he had clumsily and painstakingly mounted. They rolled all over the ground again. Julian couldn't handle it anymore. He ran back to help him. Are you okay? He said with a laugh in his throat. Cairo was on his back on a lumpy bed of raw potatoes. Yeah, no, man, I'm great. What does it look like? He reached his hand out and Julian took it to lift him. He immediately lost his grip. Dude, your hands are freezing, he said. Why are they slippery? He could see in Cairo's eyes that amongst the frustration they were tinged with fear. "There's something wrong with me." Julian could see little flecks of white forming on his eyelashes. He knelt down and put his arm around his shoulder to lift him up. It looked like both of his legs were stiff now. They held their position as Julian brought him to his feet. They acted like jointless prosthetics all the way up to his hips. Julian apologized to the wagon driver and his son as he carried his hobbling friend away. He made it back to the fountain through the hustle of the people. A few shot concerned glances in their direction, and a couple stopped to watch. Cairo slumped to the edge of the fountain and peered in at what he could see of his reflection. Julian touched his leg. "Bro, you are freezing. Your legs are hard as rocks." Cairo looked him in the eyes. He looked very scared. Julian frowned. Then he put on a brave face. He reached down into the fountain briefly to check the temperature again. "Here," he said, as he grabbed Cairo's cold, slick hand and put it into the water. Cairo leaned over and put his other hand in. He began shaking and rubbing them together under the surface to rinse them. It didn't seem to do much. Cairo pulled his hands out and rubbed them together and then put them back in. It wasn't helping. It actually seemed to be getting worse. A strange particulate began to form in the water around his fingers. Julian started to see it too. That's not... The particulate grew and grew. It was like crystals forming in the water. Cairo felt his hands getting harder and harder to rub together. His eyes widened as he felt them completely stiffen up. They were stuck together, surrounded by something. He began lifting his hands out of the water when in a flash the water changed. It was clear to both of them now as the fountain's contents completely solidified. "Ice?" said Julian. Cairo's hands were now frozen mid-pull from the water, but the water didn't just have a sheet over the top of it. The entire fountain had one solid block of ice now fixed inside it. Cairo began yanking his arms back. His hands were stuck firmly inside. He pulled and pulled with grunts of desperation. "Julian?" Julian began looking around frantically for something to break the ice with. Right, okay, A crowd began forming quickly. It wasn't long before people started shouting and calling others over. They looked at the solid clear block and Cairo stuck in it, with some touching the rock-hard surface just to check. It wasn't until the ice began slowly crawling up the young man's arms that people began shouting. "He's a Vincarsi! He's a Vincarsi! 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 Vincarsi!
Guards! The guards! Vincarsi!
Julian had stopped trying to break the solid block of the fountain and moved to Cairo's arms. He was making progress in chipping away the thinner layers by pounding it with his fists, only for it to form the layer again. Cairo was making a low, fearful groan in an attempt to release some tension so he didn't panic. A few started to look back into the crowded marketplace. Some suddenly left the fountain altogether. Cairo and Julian were too distracted to notice what was going on, but the crowd's attention slowly started leaving them. Before they knew it, there was an uproar happening outside of the group crowded around the fountain. Soon, no one was looking at the steadily freezing Cairo. Their attention had turned towards the inner walls of the market. Flags were stationed there. Neither of the boys had really noticed them when they entered. They lined each wall, flapping with the insignia of a flame. Ironically, they were being consumed by a rising fire. Gradually, a panic began to make its way through the people. Carts were being loaded and stands taken down out of fear. Julian kept at his fist pounding. It was all to no avail. The ice was thickly coating Cairo's shoulders and back. "I've got to grab something. I can't do this with my bare hands. I'm sorry. I have to go look for something." Julian's voice was pleading as he faded into the panicking crowd. Cairo lost the tear-distorted figure of his friend as the ice crept up his back. He couldn't move his head. A helmet of ice slinked over the back of his cranium and inched down his forehead. A separate sheet covered his chin and began encasing his bottom lip. He resisted against the stiffness of his body and realized he was wholly unable to move now. The ice had taken all of him. For a moment, as the last bit of his nostrils were overtaken, he thought of all the times he considered his own death. He couldn't possibly have ever foreseen this. He held his breath. His eyes now peered through a sheet of ice that only allowed him to see colors, shapes, and shadows. The panic had come in waves, and a new tide was coming. His life was about to end in a muffled scream. One of the shadows made him hold it back. Something completely filled his field of limited vision through the ice. The shadow turned from dark to intensely bright. Cairo squeezed his eyes shut. All at once he could breathe. He could hear. His eyes snapped open to see a face. It was a young woman, a beautiful one. He felt like he could go swimming in the eyes that peered down at him. She was kneeling over him as she pulled her hand from his nose and mouth. Cairo could feel the heat coming from it. "Hey, what are you doing to him?" Her hair whipped over Cairo's face as she turned her head to the sound of Julian's voice coming out of the herd of panicked people. She then turned back and made a fist. With a single strike to Cairo's ice-covered belly, the solid shell all over his body cracked and gave way. Cairo flopped onto the ground like a fish. She stood over him while looking toward the congestion of wagons and patrons around the exit. Her voice came out smooth and low. "You guys are idiots." Hey guys, it's Oliver. Thanks so much for listening. Give me a like and subscribe if you want to hear more. Support this book and my continued writing through Patreon. I'll have regular episodes up until all chapters of this story are fully released, so stay tuned.